So the hobby of shooting is a very interesting hobby. And there's a lot of different truths that you understand as you continue on with this hobby. Things like comfort in the hand doesn't really matter. Things like traditional target stands being difficult to transfer. And the topic for today, triggers. Now, what is it about triggers, you might ask, that would merit an entire video just about them? Unlike target stand transportation, which has solutions, the trigger thing is more of a realization. So first of all, a little plug for that target solution I was talking about. Here we've got the Variant Innovation target stand, which is very simple. I've got two stands with me, and it's really easy to put together. Simple as putting in your base lumber, getting your crossbar, putting everything on the ground, grabbing your uprights, and you're done. After you grab a couple of the included target holders, just slide that on, and as simple as that, you've got a target stand. We've even got a carrier for your lumber. The unfortunate part is the realization for the triggers doesn't have a solution quite as convenient as the Variant Innovation target stand. Honestly, it's less of a solution and just more of finally understanding what to give a crap about your guns. So now they've got a couple stands up, let's go grab a couple guns and let's get to work. Hey guys, Andrew here. Welcome back to Work the Trigger. On our table here, we have an assortment of different pistols. Now, each one of these different pistols we brought for a different reason. That is because they vary widely in the quality of the trigger, which is the topic for the day. Now, why do I want to talk so bad about triggers? Because triggers in firearms vary greatly. You've got everything from what is traditionally a pretty bad trigger to things that are the best trigger on the market. And the thing is that the majority of the people who really ask about that and who focus their buying power on that aspect alone are typically the people that it will benefit the least. Hear me out. So here we've got the main culprit most of the time. This is your standard Glock. This is a Glock 19 with a very stock trigger in it, and most opponents of the Glock 19 would argue very highly that this trigger is a bad trigger. I don't disagree that this trigger is not the best trigger on the market. However, bad trigger does not necessarily mean a trigger that is going to negatively impact the shooter. Now, what do I mean with that? There's a lot of different aspects when it comes to shooting a firearm, especially when you're starting off. There's a lot of fundamentals that you need to get down. You need sight picture, you need grip, you need trigger pull, and all of those things come together to build a proficient firearms user or a proficient shooter. The problem is, when you're first starting off, the majority of those fundamentals aren't there. So why does that matter in the matter of trigger? And why doesn't a good trigger, like that of the TP9 or the Walther PDP, really affect new shooters? And that is because the only time that those trigger pulls really work in your favor is if everything is functioning together, cohesively. Let's take a look for a minute at just some rudimentary basics in pistol shooting. After the round is chambered, a tight grip on the firearm with extended arms, slightly loose to be able to take up that recoil. You want to get a good grip on the pistol, point, line up your sights, and you want to gently squeeze the trigger. Now, again, that trigger pull is what we're talking about here. Getting all of those rudimentary fundamentals, sights, grip, are all bases that trigger pull then builds off of. Without those, that trigger pull is not going to be a consistent squeeze, it's just going to be a slap. And if you're just slapping the trigger, then no amount of good trigger is really going to matter. Not only that, but things like just loosening up grips a little bit makes it so that that trigger squeeze is much more likely to be able to shift your sights around than if you have that nice solid grip, again, being a foundation of your shooting. So this brings up a very important part of a pistol that I like to talk about a lot. I do it in a lot of my reviews, and that is the trigger pull profile. What the trigger is actually doing as it's moving. Is it smooth? How long is it? What type of brake does it have? And by what type of brake, I mean, does it have a rolling brake where it comes up, it builds pressure a little bit, and then just rolls right into that brake? Or is it a hard wall brake where it comes up and that pressure builds extremely quickly and extremely strongly at a certain point, and then pulling slightly through that point will go ahead and break the trigger? Glocks tend to have a little bit more rolling, a little bit less of a hard wall brake. This is a standard Glock trigger pull. We've got about 3/8 of an inch of rearward movement. We start building weight right about there. And right there, you can see we pulled right through our brake because that brake is not so much a wall as it is building up to that pressure. Again, we're coming back. You can feel it really build right about there. Then we pull right through that. Now there's a lot of other guns that have very similar trigger pull profiles, especially Glock clones. This is a PSA dagger, what is one of generally my most hated triggers. It takes the worst of all of the worst triggers. It's got the hingedness of a Smith & Wesson M&P 1.0 trigger. It's got the heavy kind of weird weight of a Gen 3 Glock trigger, and it's got massive amounts of grit. Just listen to this thing. The amount of grit on this trigger is just horrible. Now that being said, it's got that same pull as that Glock, where it pulls through, and you can pull right through it because it's less of a hard ledge and a drop. It's more of kind of a build and a roll, hence rolling trigger brake. Now on the other end of the spectrum, we have a few other guns here. So first up is the Walther PDP. These guns are all what I would consider kind of top tier for striker fired triggers. The Walther PDP has a very hard wall. You can actually hear it hit the wall, and then a little bit further, and you get that break. Now that is a much more predictable trigger break right there. Right there, okay? One thing about those rolling triggers, it's very difficult to predict when that trigger is going to break, and we'll explain why that's a big deal here in a second. Next up, we've got the Canik TP9. This is the newer meta version, and this is very similar to that Walther. It's much lighter, but there's that wall, a little bit further, and we've got that break. Again, we've got that wall and that break. You can see how on each one of these, I'm able to stop it right at that wall, unlike the Glock, where I just rolled through it a couple of times on accident. And finally, we got the CZ-P10C. Again, we've got that hard wall and that break. So all of these guns have that hard wall and the break. The Glock and Glock clones have that rolling break. But why does that matter? Why do people consider these triggers good and the Glock triggers bad? A lot of it is in the feel. A lot of the times when people are in gun stores and they're trying to select a new firearm, they will go by the feel of the firearm. Well, that feels good in the hand, it feels good. The trigger on these feels good. You can predict it, you can kind of pull back and take up slack, and you know when it's gonna go off. But that's the problem. A big problem for new shooters with something like, say, the Canik, is the understanding of when that firearm is going to shoot. The predictability of when that trigger is going to break leads them to compensate earlier or at all for that trigger. I'll show you what I mean. So right now we've got one round in the gun. You can see my trigger pull. I know exactly when it's gonna break. Now I don't have a round in the gun. I'm gonna release the trigger and let it reset. Now when I pull back, most new shooters, if they know that that gun is loaded and is going to go off, you'll see them dip the gun when they pull the trigger. That dip is a preemptive dip meant to counteract the recoil that they know is coming. Because again, you know when that is gonna go off. So the trick there is, how do you get a gun that's gonna shoot, but you're not gonna be able to compensate like that for the firing of the gun? That's where rolling triggers come in. So we're back to our PSA dagger here. We've got a 17 round mag with a null magazine adapter. Fits in really well with the gun, fits in nice and streamlined with the design. And again, we've got what I think is one of the absolute this trigger is horrendous. But it's also slightly unpredictable. Now that's not to say that you don't know if or when it's gonna go off, because you do. What that is to say is that because you've got that rolling brake, you're not going to be able to preload that and sit on that staged wall. You're going to pull right through it and essentially surprise yourself every time you take that shot. Which means you're not going to be overcompensating and pushing on the muzzle. Now with small guns, this is almost to an even higher extent, because smaller guns are going to recoil more, making you more liable to feel the need to overcompensate by pressing the muzzle. Now this is again a PSA Dagger Micro. With that same Glock style rolling brake, leading to not being able to predict when that trigger is going to go off, and therefore not overcompensate or not try to push the gun. That's why a lot of shooters see those low left hits. Now you might be asking yourself, Andrew, are you saying that you don't like the hard wall triggers, the good triggers. And I'm not saying that at all. I actually prefer these. My preferred gun of all of these that I've shot so far is the CZP-10C, which is probably like the third most solid trigger in the group, being just slightly by the PDP here, and honestly both of them are underneath where the Canic is. But that is a hard wall trigger, and it is my favorite of the bunch. But I've also shot a lot of guns, and I have worked myself around the predictability of shooting them and preemptively controlling the recoil instead of doing it afterwards. Now, I will share with you now the single biggest factor in choosing a gun and a trigger. And it is not something that we've talked about so far, but I got a couple of guns here to prove my point a little bit. So the last and most important factor about a trigger when you're looking at these guns is consistency. Not predictability, not what type of break it has, it's consistency. And to show that, I've got two different guns here. First up, I've got my Staccato C2, which is just your run-of-the-mill Staccato with a relatively decent 2011/1911 trigger pull. I also have the Apollo 11 from Live Free Armory. This is a 5-inch 2011 style gun, and I absolutely love the gun and the platform. The problem is the trigger. It's a little bit crap. And when I say crap on the Apollo 11, I don't mean that it is a rolling trigger or bad. It's inconsistent is the problem. Let's load up a magazine. Go ahead and pull it back, and we'll see if we can get it to do it, because here's the thing, it doesn't do it all the time. But as you're shooting this gun, the trigger pull actually changes. Part of that is trigger geometry, part of it is the grip safety back here, and slight variations in how you hold that grip safety down having an effect on the trigger pull. We may need more out of this one. We'll get to that in a second. But unlike the Apollo 11, the Staccato here is the exact same trigger pull every single time. Making those shots a lot more consistent in my confidence in being able to hit them, as well as my accuracy once I do. Because you see, as a shooter, you can learn to shoot pretty much any gun. Right there, you could see that inconsistency cause some major trigger freeze, because I pulled it back to where it broke the first time, and it didn't fire that time. And you can see by the rest of the magazine, it doesn't happen all the time, and that's the problem. But that's why consistency is so important, is because you need to either consistently know when it is gonna shoot or consistently not know when it's gonna shoot. But to have it change up in the middle is one of the worst things that could happen. So being able to learn any of these triggers and be able to use them with proficiency is something that will take a while. And once you do it, you'll be able to pick up pretty much any firearm and use it at least adequately. But for new shooters especially, when you're looking at a new firearm, the most important aspect of it is gonna be how you shoot it. And that shootability, whether the trigger feels great or the gun doesn't feel good in your hand, it's more important than the name, it's more important than the gun that the guy at the gun counter is trying to sell you that week. As a new shooter, setting yourself up for a win is optimal. And in order to do that, don't judge that gun on how crispy that trigger feels. Judge it instead on how you can shoot it. That can only be found out at a range. So if you're looking, find a rental, find a friend, go out and shoot these things, because I bet that that gun that doesn't feel so good in your hand is gonna shoot a lot better in the end than the one that just sinks in with that nice crispy trigger. Thanks guys for watching. I hope this video was a little bit useful to you. If you like the content, do me a favor and hit the like button down below. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. If you like what we're doing here on the channel and you want to help out a little bit, don't go over to Patreon. Don't become a YouTube member. Instead, head over to variantinnovation.com. You'll find 3D printed gun accessories over there. Remember guys, I appreciate every one of you, and until next time, do your research, get informed, and get to work. I also, ow, have a splinter.